I never considered myself a selfish person, but that all changed the night I found myself face to face with the thing I had cooked, something so ordinary yet so deeply unsettling, and how it pushed me to the brink of sanity. My parents worked long hours, leaving my younger siblings, Ryan, who was 9, and Lily, just 7, under my care, and on that fateful evening, I had taken a rare opportunity to experiment in the kitchen, something they usually encouraged but rarely had time for. I decided to whip up a batch of spaghetti and meatballs, a family classic that I thought they'd devour. The aroma wafted through the house, curling along the walls and wrapping around the corners, promising warmth and satisfaction. But the moment I called them to the table, their faces shifted from curiosity to disgust faster than I could blink. Ryan wrinkled his nose, pushing the plate away, while Lily, in her innocent defiance, declared she'd rather starve. I felt a wave of embarrassment flood my cheeks. After all the effort, after all the chopping and stirring, all I received were pouts and tantrums from two kids who would have preferred a cold slice of pizza or, even worse, the remnants of the last week's takeout. I tried reasoning with them, explaining how cooking was hard work, that I put my heart into this dish, but they seemed impervious to my pleas, their whining crescendoing until I felt as if my skin was crawling with irritation. Finally, I snapped, "Fine, if you don't want to eat it, don't. I won't cook you a second meal." The silence that followed was suffocating, but their half-hearted whimpers melted into fake sobs as they pushed their chairs back and skulked away, leaving me to simmer in my frustration alone. I thought they'd go to bed hungry, perhaps even learn a lesson about appreciation. Instead, it seemed I was the one cast as the villain in a twisted fairy tale. After an hour of silence thick enough to cut through, filled with the dread of impending accusations from my parents, I heard a series of soft, rhythmic thuds outside the kitchen window. I approached cautiously, peering out into the darkening yard, feeling an unsettling chill envelop me. To my disbelief, I noticed two distinct shapes just beyond the glow of the streetlight, Ryan and Lily, not playing but standing still, their backs towards me. They wore their usual pajamas, but something was off, their postures rigid like puppets with tangled strings. "What are you two doing out there?" I called, but they didn't respond, they just stood there, unmoving. A cold fear crept into my stomach. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but the screen flickered, the sudden loss of battery rendering me helpless. I decided I'd had enough of this strange tableau and stepped outside, my heart pounding in my ears as I approached, calling their names again. As I got closer, the silhouette of my siblings twisted into something grotesque, their limbs began to twitch unnaturally, and before I could process it, they turned their heads in unison, their faces contorted into wide, eerie grins that seemed impossible for anyone who wasn't completely lost in madness. "We're not hungry anymore," they screeched in a voice that was neither of them, a chorus of distorted laughter exploding into the stillness of the night. My breath caught in my throat, a primal urge to run surged through me, but I was rooted in place, entranced by this horror unfolding before me. I backed away, but as I turned, I tripped, hitting the ground hard. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a whisper so soft I almost didn't catch it. "You said we should learn a lesson." I shot back to my feet and sprinted inside, slamming the door behind me, locking it with trembling hands. I tried to convince myself it was just a fever dream, that my imagination was running wild due to their refusal to eat, but in the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow glide past the window, pacing back and forth as I huddled in a corner like a child afraid of the dark. The incessant tapping began again, this time accompanied by urgent whispers that clawed at my consciousness, a language I couldn't decipher but felt deeply lodged in my psyche. I grabbed a heavy kitchen knife, adrenaline coursing as I envisioned defending myself against whatever malevolence had taken hold of my siblings. I screamed their names, but all I got in response was a cacophony that churned in my gut, mocking my distress. As the night dragged on, their laughter echoed in the surrounding darkness, a nightmarish lullaby I couldn't escape. I dared to peek outside, and my heart shattered at the fantasy. They were gone, replaced by an abyss that seemed to yawn before me. Hours passed in a daze, and when dawn finally broke, I curled into a ball on the couch, racked with guilt and dread, unsure if I would face a paranormal nightmare or the wrath of my parents. The light spilled through the window, illuminating the room in a ghostly orange hue. When I summoned the courage to look outside, the yard was empty, devoid of my siblings, free of the twisted realities that had grappled me in the night. They appeared eventually, nonchalant as ever, the peculiar grins faded like the terrors of a waking dream. I didn't mention last night's episode, after all, who would believe me? My parents returned, and everything settled back into the repetitive rhythm of the household, yet a cold thread of tension weaved itself through our lives, quiet moments punctuated by lingering glances and echoes of that laughter, my siblings seemingly unaware of the change in their demeanor, but I recognized the flicker of something darker beneath their innocent facade. Days turned into weeks, and the dread only thickened. I started finding leftovers of food I hadn't made, twisted shapes of Play-Doh like meat, unrecognizable but oddly reminiscent of what I had cooked, lurking in dark corners. I attempted to make my case known, but it sounded ludicrous, and so I buried the fear beneath daily routines, buried it until it became a constant presence, a reminder of one fateful night when I had refused to nurture. I shivered, often dreaming of the dark laughter that would not let me sleep, forever chained to the guilt that grew like a weed. And one night, when the winds whispered through the cracks of our home, I dared to lay my head in resigned silence, but was pulled back into that heavy absence, my siblings out once more, standing like specters beneath the streetlights, faces illuminated in a sickly hue, as if a portal had cracked open between realms, and I was forced to face a harbinger of dread, knowing that somewhere inside I had sealed our fates the day I decided to abandon the very essence of what it meant to share a meal. As I gazed upon their twisted forms, I desperately wished to retract my words, to cook them anything they wanted, though I feared the cost would be far more than a second dinner, and the shadows hinted that the lesson had only just begun to unravel. A few weeks ago, I found myself in a situation that left me questioning my sanity and ultimately led me to this moment of confession. My cousin Jamie is 7, and he is, without a doubt, the most insufferable little monster I've ever encountered. From tantrums that could wake the dead to the way he crafts intricate lies just to see how far he can push the adults in his life, it's a miracle that he hasn't driven my poor aunt to the brink of madness. When my aunt asked me to babysit him for the weekend while she took on extra shifts at her job, a request that came with the guilt trip about how much she needed the money, I felt the flood of irritation rise within me. It wasn't just the idea of babysitting Jamie that made my skin crawl, it was the knowledge that he would spend the day trying to find creative ways to torture my patience. I remember the last time I babysat him, he told my aunt I had locked him in the bathroom for hours when I only stepped out to grab my phone from the kitchen, and she believed him without questioning a single word. Heart-pounding, the memory of his sweet, innocent smiling face as he recounted that fabricated tale to her on the phone replayed in my mind, and I snapped, AITA for refusing. I had meant to gently decline, but my frustration erupted, and I told her I couldn't babysit a lying brat and that Jamie didn't deserve my help. The silence on the line spoke more than 100 words, and I could almost hear her heart shatter through the phone. I hung up, instantly filled with regret and the gnawing dread of what my refusal might mean for her job. Uncharacteristically, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had crossed a line, but I convinced myself that it was for my own sanity. That night, a gnawing sense of dread settled deep in my gut, as if I'd unknowingly invoked an ancient curse. It wasn't until the night of my refusal, just as I struggled to fall asleep, that I flicked off my lamp and was met with a whisper that slithered through the shadows of the room, the distinct sound of a child's laughter merging with the eerie creak of floorboards. My heart raced as I turned to face the darkened corner where the shadows projected odd shapes, and I dismissed it as a trick of my imagination. Yet, when I shut my eyes again, I could still hear it, his laughter, soft and sinister. Over the next few nights, the laughter grew louder and more distorted, as if taunting me for my past refusal, and I began experiencing vivid nightmares of Jamie lurking just outside my bedroom door, a twisted grin stitched across his face, his eyes glimmering with malice that should have never existed in a child. These weren't ordinary nightmares but vivid reenactments of every terrible thing he had done to me, the time he convinced me to jump into a freezing pool so he could watch me flail, or when he deliberately spilled soda all over my homework and feigned ignorance. He was attempting to break through in some dark, demonic way. I started doubting my reality. Was Jamie truly a lying brat, or was there a different, more sinister entity taking control of him? The whole week passed in a haze, each night marked by a new scream echoing in my mind, and each day drained me further. My aunt was clearly worried. She texted me not only to reassure me about Jamie but promised she wouldn't leave him with me ever again. Still, every time I thought of Jamie, I saw the flicker of something dreadful behind his eyes, almost a hunger for chaos that made my heart flutter with dread. And just as I began entertaining the idea of going to my aunt to apologize, a storm rolled in, pounding against my windows like a frantic child desperate for attention, forcing me to confront my refusal once and for all. 4 nights in, I was yanked from a thick slumber by the sound of footsteps in my living room and a familiar cackle that sent icy dread pooling in my stomach. Tired, shaky, and on edge, I crept down the hallway, my heart thumping hard enough to overlay the sounds of thunder. As I rounded the corner, clutching my phone like a fast-acting spell against whatever overlap between dream and reality awaited me, I came face to face with Jamie, grinning, his small figure silhouetted by moonlight spilling through my window. Except this time, there was something off about him, a deep shadow hanging over his form, almost tethering him to the floor as if gravity itself hungered to keep him from escaping my view. "Can I come in?" His voice was sweet, yet sinister, a perfect harmony of the innocent tone wrapped around the darkness that slipped through the walls like smoke. I blinked, unsure how to respond, frozen in the threshold of my own home. Was this truly my cousin, or had the shadows taken his form? "Let me in," he urged again, the sweetness giving way to a disturbing insistence, and as I stood there, every fiber of my being screamed at me to run. But I was paralyzed as we locked eyes, and if I hadn't summoned the will to yank the door shut, someone, would have slipped inside. After that encounter, I very nearly convinced myself I was losing my grip on reality, my mind betraying me, robbing me of the line between imagination and truth. But every scream of laughter echoing through the dark only bolstered my conviction that I had come face to face with something wicked. Days turned into a blur of anxiety as I huddled away from the world, each corner I turned feeling haunted by the shadow of laughter that taunted me from just beyond reach. When I heard a faint knock at the door days later, I felt my blood run cold, and for once, I thought of checking to see who would be foolish enough to knock after everything, but the creeping dread rooted me in place. Then, a faint giggle burst through, and I knew it was Jamie. Memories of my aunt pleading with me to forgive him flashed, but deep down, I understood my refusal echoed through to this day, and I prayed the darkness would answer since I didn't dare look up at the door. Instead of opening up, I chose to remain haunted by the shadow of that constant laughter, and in a twisted reality I had only begun to comprehend. I waited, driven out of necessity to understand that some monsters are very real and don't exist merely in stories. I chose to ignore that knock, hoping to bury my guilt in silence, but what would I do now when, no matter where I turned, the sound of Jamie's laughter remained a reminder of the child I once knew who now belonged to the dark? I never thought a weekend getaway with my boyfriend and his family would leave me questioning my sanity, but here we are, with the shadows of the house enveloping me like a dark quilt of dread. It started innocently enough, with laughter filling the cozy air of his parents' cabin in the woods. We were greeted with warm hugs and the promise of memorable times, but as night fell, something felt off. The first evening, everything seemed fine, the arrangements were simple, two couples sleeping in respective bedrooms, and I felt comfortable nestled next to my boyfriend. However, I couldn't shake the feeling that his brother, Aaron, and his wife, Tara, were being overly favorable. They had just had a baby, which in turn shifted the dynamics. Everyone seems to tiptoe around them, as if their new little bundle of joy had installed an invisible hierarchy. The next morning, while I made coffee in the dim light of the kitchen, I overheard whispers in the living room, Aaron and Tara discussing how much easier they'd sleep in their own space and how much they appreciated the flexible accommodations this weekend. My mind raced. Flexible? I felt a lump form in my throat. We had less privacy because they brought their newborn, but nobody had bothered to consider how it would affect us. That night, I realized the sleeping arrangements had shifted again. Instead of sharing the queen bed in the guest room with my boyfriend, he was being shuttled to the living room sofa by his parents, while Aaron and Tara insisted on taking the guest room for the sake of the baby. The indignation rose in me like bile, and I couldn't hold back. When we gathered around the dinner table, I drew a deep breath and questioned why our plans had changed. I thought we were supposed to share the guest room, I probed, venom drenching my words despite my best efforts. His parents exchanged knowing glances, and I could feel tension crackling in the air like static. "Ah, sweetheart, we made accommodations for Aaron and Tara. You understand, right?" My boyfriend's mother, Brenda, responded in that sugary tone meant to placate, but I tasted the bitterness. "No, I don't understand. We're all adults here, I don't see why their sleeping arrangement takes precedence." My voice was louder than I intended, and every pair of eyes locked onto me, filled with a mix of shock and disbelief. "Tara is nursing," Aaron's voice broke through like ice, sharp and accusing. "What do you expect us to do?" Suddenly, the laughter of earlier seemed like a distant memory, and the room became thick with unspoken words and judgment. The dinner turned into an awkward game of silence, heavy and foreboding, and I felt utterly alone despite being surrounded by family. Yet, the more I stewed in my indignation, the more I longed for clarity, for some shred of acknowledgement that the unfairness was real. As darkness enveloped the cabin, I lay curled around the edges of myself, silence stalking me like a predator, and I could hear the soft cooings of the baby and the muffled laughter of the others in the living room. I slipped out into the hallway, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet, frustrated and lost. I could hear my boyfriend's breath beneath the sofa, as I tiptoed past the open guest bedroom, where the shadows cast by the nightlight danced ominously across the walls. The room felt cursed, a trap designed to keep me from reclaiming my sanity. It was then that I overheard a conversation drifting from the living room, cloaked in laughter and familiarity. "She really needs to mind her place," Brenda said, and each of her words felt like a knife cutting into me. "I just don't know why we're coddling her. It's not like she's family." My heart dropped like a stone in a well, the implications crashed over me, and suddenly, the realization that I was considered other in this family simmered under my skin. I mustered the courage and stepped back into their world, a world painted in shades of favoritism and bias. "Why am I being pushed aside?" I demanded, standing firm despite the quaking in my voice. The laughter halted, and all eyes swung toward me. "I'm not asking for special treatment, I just want to be treated equally." They shifted uncomfortably as I forced them to confront the truth that hung in the air, thick as fog. I could see the irritation flare in Aaron's eyes, while Tara remained quietly smug, nursing their sweet little privilege. "You're overreacting," Brenda scoffed, and I could feel heat coursing through my veins, a bubbling cauldron of adrenaline. "No, I'm fighting for fairness," I shot back, feeling a strange empowerment surge within me. The tension unraveled as Aaron slammed his fist on the table, rising to meet me, his face flushed with anger. "You think you deserve something special just because you're dating our brother? Get real." It felt like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, I regretted voicing my frustrations, until I saw the conflict brewing behind my boyfriend's eyes. I could tell he was torn, caught between the impulse to defend me and the suffocating loyalty to his family that had been drummed into him since he was little. Finally, instead of collapsing under the weight of their cruel laughter, I turned my back on the room and marched out towards the exit. I needed air, fresh and untarnished, away from the clutches of their toxicity. As I reached the front porch, the moon hung low, bathing everything in a silvery hue that strangely felt like a blessing. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath of the fragrant pine, and my mind spun in circles, torn between loyalty and the burgeoning realization of who I am. Suddenly, the door behind me creaked open. I turned slowly to see my boyfriend standing there, a mix of shame and sorrow in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice shaky. "I should have said something." But as he said it, I realized that words often mean nothing without action. And in that moment, wrapped in the solitude of darkness, I understood something terrifying. I was the outsider here. "You can't apologize if you don't mean it," I said, my heart breaking with every syllable. His face fell, and the heaviness of my own truth rooted me to the spot. I wanted to run but instead felt the weight of the world on my shoulders as realization sank in. What was I, if not a mere guest in a house that should have felt like home? But as the night unfolded, the silence became a canvas where I painted the chilling realization: sometimes the truth is that you don't belong, even when love is tangled in the mess. And as my feet pushed me away from the cabin, echoes of their laughter haunting my ears like shadows, I knew I had crossed a line that was never meant to be crossed, and the darkness of the woods became my only solace as they faded into the background, leaving me to navigate the twisted path of life alone. I never thought a simple time test could spiral into a living nightmare, but here we are, and I need to share what happened before it consumes me entirely. My husband, Aaron, has always been my biggest supporter, or at least that's what I believed until last week. With finals approaching, I dedicated a Saturday to prepare for my final exam, the kind worth a significant chunk of my grade. I set up in our small bedroom, a dimly lit space that was usually filled with warmth but felt claustrophobic under the pressure of looming deadlines. I had placed my phone on Do Not Disturb, drowning out the world, steeling my will against distractions, and I was well into a practice test when I heard the faint creaking of the door. I wasn't sure whether it was my mind playing tricks on me or a genuine sound breaking my concentration. I told myself I was just imagining it and pressed ahead. The clock was ticking. I could feel my heart rate sinking with its relentless countdown. Just as I reached a particularly tricky question, the door swung open wider than expected, and there stood Aaron, his face an unreadable mask. He didn't knock. He didn't even wait for me to acknowledge him. He simply walked in and, without a word, grabbed the empty coffee cup from my cluttered desk, which wouldn't have been a big deal under normal circumstances, but in that moment, it felt like the ultimate betrayal. I exploded, shouting for him to get out and that I was in the middle of an important test. The look on his face morphed into confusion and hurt, making me feel worse almost instantly, yet a primal anger surged in me, an instinctive need to protect my focus at all costs, and I didn't realize I had crossed a line. Aaron backed away as if struck, retreating without another word, and I immediately regretted my outburst. It was never my intention to hurt him, but in the throes of tension, I was blind to everything else. Shaking, I tried to refocus, but the heaviness of my guilt loomed larger than any countdown timer. When I finally returned to the living room post-test, my heart sank deeper. The usually vibrant space felt hollow, too quiet, with tension hanging thick in the air. "Aaron?" I called hesitantly, my voice a small echo against the silence. No answer. I felt a cold dread seep into my bones. I checked the kitchen, the bathroom, and then the spare room, but each corner of our home held only emptiness. Panic tightened my throat as I grabbed my phone, ready to text him, but just as I was about to fire off a message, I noticed my notifications lighting up. The group chat with my classmates was flooded with frantic messages. "Did you hear about Aaron? I can't believe it, they were right near the corner." And then the most chilling of them all, "They said his car is gone." My heart dropped as a gnawing realization settled in. They were talking about the car accident in the news, and my mind raced with desperate images of a twisted metal heap, my husband a possible victim, consequences of his day spiraling out of control for reasons I couldn't fathom. I raced to the living room TV, where a breaking news segment flickered to life, reporters framed by flashing lights, and there was Aaron's car smashed against a tree, completely unrecognizable. They were saying something about speed, a reckless driver, and I felt the world around me shatter anew with every word. Somehow, I remained stuck in my own head, trapped between the anger I felt moments earlier and the fear gripping me now, unable to disentangle from the chaos I had already created. It was my fault. I had shut him out during a moment of sheer panic, blinded by my own selfish needs. I dropped to the floor, tears streaming down my face as guilt twisted into a knot in my stomach. What if he didn't make it? What if my voice had been the last thing he heard? I couldn't bear the thought. I grabbed my things and raced out the door, my heart pounding like a war drum against my ribcage as I sped toward the hospital, weaving through traffic with reckless abandon. Every red light felt like a ticking clock reminding me that I may have lost the only person who meant anything to me. When I finally made it to the ER, a haze of white coats and muffled voices surrounded me, and I stumbled onto a nurse who stopped me, her face a mask of professionalism that seemed utterly indifferent, and my gut twisted with urgency. "Please, where is he?" The nurse looked down and spoke carefully, almost as if she were preparing to shatter whatever shred of hope re-entered my heart. "You'll need to wait, ma'am. We're doing everything we can." I felt my heart drop into the depths of despair as the minutes turned into hours, each tick of the clock a cruel reminder of my own actions. The waiting area morphed from an ordinary space into a suffocating chamber of dread where guilt gnawed at my insides, replaying our last moments together like a broken record. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a doctor appeared, and my soul practically leapt into my throat. "He's stable," she said cautiously, "but he's unconscious. You can see him, but..." She paused, and the world around me faded out for a moment. "It's serious." The words felt like ice as I walked into the stark hospital room, seeing Aaron there, hooked to machines, wires snaking around him, face bruised and battered. Reality collided with my trauma, crashing into me with violent force. I approached the bed, heart heavy with emotion, wishing I could take back everything, shouting, turning away. I gently took his hand, squeezing it tightly as if my life depended on it. "I'm so sorry, Aaron. I never wanted this. I had no idea how much I needed you until I almost lost you." Tears continued to flow freely as I sat there, whispering to him, pouring out all the love and regret that had built up inside me. As days turned into a week, the fragile threads of hope began to weave through the darkness, and Aaron slowly started to regain consciousness. The first time his eyes fluttered open, dread coursed through me. What would he say? Would he hate me? I couldn't face that possibility. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't remember the fight, praying my words had reached him somehow. He turned his head slightly, squinting at the harsh fluorescent lights before his gaze fell on me, bewilderment etched across his face. "What happened?" He managed to croak, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of relief mixed with dread as I prepared to answer. This moment felt pivotal, but in his eyes, I saw forgiveness, possibly a reflection of my own guilt. Maybe he could sense the crushing weight of my regret, or maybe it was just the haze of pain killing every harsh thought. All I could do was nod and squeeze his hand tighter, letting the tears flow. "You got into an accident," I said softly. "You're here now. Just focus on getting better." We had a long road ahead of us, and in that uncertain future lay the lessons of a nightmarish reality, one that had shaken our lives and reminded me of the fragility of every moment we take for granted. It's wild how quickly everything can change, how a simple act of frustration in an innocent moment can lead us to the brink before bringing us back in character-shattering ways. It was in those darkest hours that I realized it was never about the test, but rather the love and understanding we have to nurture. Life is too unpredictable. I vowed never to take him for granted again. So, am I the asshole for shouting at him during a timed test? I'm not sure if that label matters anymore. I thought I was doing the right thing when I invited my daughter, Ella, to my wedding. It was supposed to be my special day, a celebration of love that I had waited so long for, yet it quickly turned into a nightmare that threatened to unravel everything I had built. The wedding was supposed to be child-free, a choice my fiancé and I made after years of hearing the endless howls of kids at weddings, tugging at their parents' dresses, sticky hands everywhere, but I just couldn't bear the thought of leaving Ella with a babysitter that night. Her big, brown eyes filled with trust seemed to pierce through my steely resolve. I had spent so much time and effort planning this day, but the real truth gnawed at my insides. My ex-husband and the battles over custody had stripped so much joy from my life, the kind of joy that only a parent knew. Ella was not just my daughter, she was my greatest happiness in a life littered with heartbreak. When the day finally arrived, I felt a tension knotting my stomach. My friends raised eyebrows over Ella's presence, some shot disapproving glances as she twirled in her little dress, a tiny sunshine among the cynical clouds of adult resentment. I tried to brush off their comments, reassure them that she would be quiet, but deep down I feared this decision would come back to haunt me. As we exchanged vows beneath a blooming arch, Ella's laughter punctuated the solemnity of the moment, the sound bouncing off the walls of our carefully chosen venue, and for a fleeting second, I thought that maybe I had made the right choice, that love was expansive, that it could include the children we cherished. But as the reception began, chaos erupted in a way I couldn't have imagined. Ella, normally so sweet and well-mannered, seemed to sense my anxiety. She fidgeted around the table, her previous joy twisted into a frantic whirl of energy. Guests looked on with thinly veiled discomfort, and when she knocked over a whole tray of hors d'oeuvres, the loud crash reverberated around the space like a gunshot. The laughter quickly faded into whispers, the sight of my fiancé's face crumpling into pale frustration. "This is supposed to be a special day for us, can't you control her?" He hissed through clenched teeth, and I felt my heart splinter at his words. How could he say that? She was my daughter, my little miracle bathed in sun, and in that moment, the words felt as sharp as knives. I tried to explain, tried to apologize to my guests, who were visibly uncomfortable watching my face turn crimson with embarrassment, but I could feel the judgments rise like a palpable fog, affecting even the tightest of relationships, crumbling them beneath unseen pressures. A few brave souls tried to coax Ella back into calmness, but when I witnessed her slip into the shadows, a cute little flower girl becoming a confused little shadow, I rushed after her, desperate to find her back. It was in a small alcove near the bathrooms that I first saw it, a dark figure looming. It had to be a trick of the light, perhaps a misstep of my imagination, but the way its shadows stretched unnaturally across the tiled wall made my stomach holler. I took a step back in hesitation, but Ella laughed to greet the figure, drawing closer as it engulfed her in a cold haze. Panic clawed inside me, and I lunged for her as the figure raised a pale hand that flickered like a dying bulb. "Ella, come back!" I screeched, my voice a shriek that sliced through the laughter drifting from the reception. I yanked Ella into my arms just in time, and our eyes locked, a wondrous mixture of fear and diligence coiling in her innocence, shadows shattering beneath the flickering lights above us, replacing laughter with an ominous hum. My fiancé and the guests had begun to filter toward us, drawn by my sudden panic as I tried desperately to shield her from the darkness that prowled around the corners where no one dared to look. He was furious, and when he saw how scared I was, his anger morphed into confusion, but when he looked upon Ella, my precious girl clutching my hand with terror etched into her little features, his warmth shattered. I saw it, the way his eyes flicked back to the figure, now hovering silently, a spot of ink threatening to consume my life in darkness. People were gasping as the words fell from my lips, things I could barely comprehend. It's coming for her. But as I tried to urge him to flee, to run, the shadows engulfed the light, filling the room with whispers of my past regrets, and it seemed uncertainty struck him harder than fear, causing him to freeze as the figure drew ever closer, the darkness twirling around like wisps of smoke. As the chaos descended, guests fled to the corners, drawn into their own fears and superstitions, even if no one truly understood what was happening, and I was left holding Ella, the weight of my choices crashing like waves against my breastplate. The figure began to laugh, a twisted, echoing sound like shattered glass, and as I turned away from it to shield my daughter from the chaos, I felt the warmth seep from my soul. Nobody was coming to help. Desperation clawed at me, and with one last surge of strength, I broke free from the icy void, pushing through friends and family, shivering against the noise that raged around me to escape into the night. We barely made it to the car, the headlights flickering like the sanctity of promises broken, as that chilling laughter still echoed behind. Inside, the air grew thick with tension, a web of haunting memories woven in silence, and I tried to comfort Ella, but the truth hung in the air like a dark cloud. We barely escaped, but we still bore the burden of fear, of choices lost to shadows yearning to reclaim what it could never have. Some may say I was the villain of my own story, Ida for bringing her where she was never meant to be, but in that darkness, I started to realize that the real question was how far I would go to protect my daughter from an entity that represented all my past mistakes, draped in the guise of love and light. As we drove away, Ella's gentle question pierced through the suffocating veil, "Mom, are we ever going back?" And I didn't have an answer. I always thought of my sister as my best friend, but everything changed when she married Mark. He was charming at first, but something about him gave me the creeps, like he was always watching, calculating. When they moved into the same town, I was excited to be closer to her, but the more I interacted with Mark, the more I sensed his controlling nature lurking beneath the surface. I'd find myself cringing at the way he spoke to her, each word coated in a smug arrogance that seemed to grow brazen as time went on. He'd often interrupt her, making her laugh off his jabs like they were just bad jokes while I could see the hurt flash across her face. I tried to talk to her about it once, but she brushed it off, insisting he was just being protective, and I could feel an icy wall build between us as she defended him. But there was something inside me that refused to back down. It felt wrong, like watching a slow train wreck you were powerless to stop. Then one afternoon, as I walked by a florist, an idea sprouted in my mind, dark, mischievous, and maybe a little vindictive. I decided to send her flowers anonymously, nothing too extravagant, just a simple bouquet with a note that read, "You deserve better." At first, I thought it would lift her spirits, a small reminder that she was loved outside of her marriage, but when I saw the hurt in her eyes during dinner as she showed them to Mark, everything took a horrifying twist. He exploded, throwing around accusations that I was trying to seduce her, that I'd always been jealous of their relationship, and my heart sank as I realized the depth of his paranoia. To keep the peace, she apologized, but I swore I saw a flicker of recognition in her gaze, a silent acknowledgement that maybe I was right. The next week, I sent another bouquet, more elaborate this time, with a note that said, "You're worth so much more than this." Her laughter was hollow when she showed them to Mark, who turned scarlet, eyes blazing. He snapped at her, demanding to know who was sending the flowers, and this time, I could see the chains tightening around her. The fragile smile she offered cracked under the weight of his fury, and I felt sick to my stomach knowing I was the catalyst for his wrath. I thought she'd open up to me, confide in me about how she felt trapped, but instead, she retreated into herself, and for weeks, I would hear her forced laughter from the other room, as if she were trying to convince herself everything was fine. I hesitated to send another bouquet, but my urge to protect her consumed me. It screamed that I had to keep hope alive somehow. So, I decided to send a single red rose with the note, "Remember who you are." When she found it, Mark threw a fit so intense I could hear him all the way from my apartment, the walls shaking with his forced masculinity. I worried he'd become abusive, prayed he wouldn't cross that line, but every time I saw her, I sensed more cracks appearing in her facade. I could tell she was unhappy now. The strained look on her face told me everything I needed to know, but still, she didn't say a word to me. Days turned to weeks, and with every flower, I felt the line between caring older brother and meddling lunatic blurring. One night, I received an unmarked envelope on my doorstep, and when I opened it, my heart stopped. It was a photograph of me taken from an angle that could only have been taken from the window of my apartment, followed by an ominous note saying, "Stop." Fear gripped me, tightening like a vice. I knew it was Mark, threatening me that I was crossing some line, but a part of me didn't care. I contemplated reaching out to my sister, but I knew it would only unleash hell. I was trapped in this spiral, unable to save her without destroying our relationship entirely. As I lay awake at night, the resolution to protect her only grew. Mark was a disease, and I was an antibiotic trying to fight it, so I decided to make one last move. I hired a private investigator to gather evidence, to follow Mark and see who he really was, hoping I could save her from whatever hell he had dragged her into. The investigator uncovered chilling truths. Mark had a record of harassment with previous girlfriends, and he'd been reported multiple times for suspicious behavior. Armed with evidence, I finally confronted my sister, pouring out everything I had learned in a desperate attempt to reach her. But instead of relief, something in her demeanor changed. Her eyes hardened as she turned away, and my heart sank. She called Mark immediately, and when he arrived, the storm that followed was catastrophic. He accused me of stalking him, of invading our lives, and I was filled with such dread when she didn't defend me that I knew I had lost her. My heart twisted as I realized the depths of her loyalty to him, a loyalty he had fostered through manipulation and fear. That night, I sat in fog-filled despair, staring at the walls of my lonely apartment, my phone buzzing with messages from my sister saying she never wanted to talk to me again, that I had ruined her life. My gut twisted. The only sound in the room was my shaky breaths as I mourned the loss of her light in my life. But then, just as I thought things couldn't get worse, the investigator called me with urgent news. Mark had a plan to leave the state with my sister. Panic coursed through my veins like ice as I rushed to her apartment, ready to beg her to stay, to fight for her. But when I arrived, I found the door ajar, the shadows inside stretching like nightmares, and the heavy quiet beckoning me to step into what felt like doom. I called out her name, dread flooding my senses, and when I stepped inside, the chilling sight I found left my heart in shards. The living room was a mess, overturned furniture, shattered glass, and in the center of it all, my sister, the fear painted across her face, standing before Mark who was seething with rage. I didn't recognize the man I once thought charming. He was a monster now, and before I could think, my protective instincts kicked in. I lunged forward, and what followed was a blur. Mark shouted something about betrayal, and as I fell, the two of us clashed in a tangle of limbs and fury. In that moment, I knew I had crossed a line, but my concern morphed into desperation as I tried to shield her from his rage. Then, in an instant, it shifted. I suddenly saw the fear in her eyes, but not for Mark. She was afraid of me. The realization hit hard as I stumbled back, horror-stricken to see her stance alongside him. "You have to leave. You're only making everything worse," she screamed, and the betrayal pierced through me like a knife. As the weight of her words sank in, I felt the ground fall beneath me, devastation swirling in my chest like a vast ocean of despair. The door slammed shut behind me as the frantic isolation pressed in around me. I grasped the fire escape's railing, doubled over in disbelief, then sat numbly against the cool metal, feeling the world morph into a blurred haze. That's when I realized it. I had become the monster. All my actions, my desperate attempts to save her had only led to more suffering. In trying to rescue her from a controlling husband, I had become someone who cornered her into a space of fear. And as I sat there overcome with emptiness, the shadows around me grew more oppressive. I could almost hear Mark's smug laughter echoing in the stillness, and for a fleeting moment, a chilling thought took root. Maybe those flowers had turned into something dark. Were they ever truly about helping her, or had I just harmed the only person I loved? At that moment, I realized I would never be able to sleep soundly again. Last summer, I moved into a small neighborhood where everyone seemed friendly at first, but things took a bizarre turn after I had a confrontation with my neighbor, Mr. Thompson. It all started when I casually mentioned to him, while he was washing his yard gnomes, how I preferred parking in my designated spot because it was the only small power I had in the chaos of moving into a new place. He chuckled, waving his sponge like a wand, and assured me he understood my plight. But weeks later, I got the unmistakable vibe that he didn't. Each night after work, I'd come home to find his dented old pickup parked in my spot, encroaching on my territory like a predator marking its territory. Feeling bold one evening, I knocked on his door, my heart thumping violently, and explained my frustration. He grinned wider than any normal person could, his smile stretching across his face until it felt like it threatened to split him open. "It's just a spot," he said, a hint of something darker threading through his placid demeanor, like oil slicking through water. I had to sleep on it before responding because it unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. The following week, I returned home to find his truck occupying my space yet again, and with it, I felt a surge of familiar dread, though I couldn't quite place why. That night, a heavy storm washed over the neighborhood, accompanied by howling winds that rattled windows and sent branches skittering across the pavement. In the middle of my insomnia-fueled anxiety, I thought I heard someone tapping at my window. Peeking through the blinds, I was shocked to see Mr. Thompson standing there, drenched, his face smeared with rain and shadows, that same smile plastered on, more disturbing than ever. He called my name in this playful sing-song voice, but I swear, behind his eyes was something twisted, as if a different creature was behind them. Terrified, I yanked away from the window, hoping he'd disappear, praying for the dawn to come and that everything would just make sense again. The next morning, filled with anxiety-induced bravado, I marched back to his house to confront him fully. His wife, a ghostly figure I rarely saw, answered, her eyes glazed over as if she was looking through the world. I asked her if Mr. Thompson had come home last night, and she blinked at me, slowly, then in a flat voice said he was out working late at the greenhouse. I didn't even know he had one. Confused and feeling a sense of foreboding, I repeated the words in my head like a mantra as I took note of the strange plant-shaped shadows lurking at the edge of his yard. Days passed, and each evening he blocked my parking spot again until I snapped. I marched over, my blood hot and my hands trembling, and confronted him in front of his wife, who just stood there, slack-jawed. "You need to stop parking in my space," I shouted, the sunlight flickering through the leaves casting an eerie glow on us, and for once, Mr. Thompson's smile faded, replaced by a cold, hard glare that cut deep as if he weighed the consequence of my existence. He leaned closer, the air around him growing thick, and that's when I noticed how strange he smelled, like fresh soil and something rotten, before muttering something I couldn't comprehend, words that slithered into an unnatural hiss. I backed away slowly, hurriedly retreating home, but the very next day, I found my car's tires slashed, neatly done with the precision of a surgeon. Fear crept through me as I watched that cursed pickup parked yet again in my designated spot later that night. Deciding I couldn't take it anymore, I filed a complaint with the HOA, but nothing came of it. Apparently, they were quite fond of Mr. Thompson and had no reason to believe my story. In an act of desperate folly, I turned to social media and connected with a local group about neighborhood issues, sharing my strange, escalating situation. Surprisingly, others chimed in with their strange experiences of him. People spoke of unsettling artworks made of nature's remnants that he gifted them, of their pets going missing. The fear blossomed into something all-consuming, and I couldn't shake off the feeling that Mr. Thompson was somehow connected to the missing pets, perhaps a sacrifice to the odd, twisted plants that apparently thrived in his mysterious greenhouse. Then, on a particularly tense night, I heard rustling outside my house, followed by soft whispering. Peering outside, my stomach dropped. There he was, Mr. Thompson, standing among the shadows with some others, figures I didn't recognize, as they circled something low to the ground. The dim light caught the glimmer of a long, slender object that glistened like a knife. Before I could catch my breath, they turned in unison, their expressions becoming warped, contorted mixtures of glee and malevolence, eyes shining like bleached bone, and I stumbled backward, panic spiking, the dark veil of night swallowing me whole. I resolved to end this once and for all. I waited until the next evening, finally gathering enough courage to sneak into his backyard. I needed proof. Just as I ducked beneath the overgrown vines, there it was, the greenhouse, more like a mausoleum, shrouded in darkness, where the air felt heavy with secrets. Peering through the glass, I could barely breathe. What I saw would haunt me forever. Inside lay not just plants but fragments of what looked unmistakably like the missing pets, their fur woven intricately amidst the foliage in a reverent show of grotesque artistry. Bottles of dark liquid lined the shelves, and I realized I had stumbled upon something far worse than mere vengeance over a parking spot. They had turned into something sinister, a cult dedicated to reclaiming life through bizarre rituals, and suddenly, my car didn't seem like an innocent dispute anymore. It was an offering of insidious attention. I slipped back home, heart pounding in rhythm to my blind terror, attempting to rationalize what I'd seen but knowing deep down there was a price to pay. Despite my fears, I couldn't let him continue getting away with it. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I had inadvertently become the centerpiece of their twisted offering, the outsider whose boundaries they would not respect. I dug deeper into local lore and found a chilling story of disappearances linked to a green thumb that preyed on the naive and unsuspecting, a sordid tale of nature reclaiming itself through blood and bone. By the end of that cursed week, I was determined to leave, sneaking out under the cover of dawn, but when I got to my car, I saw at least 5 gnarled, vine-like tendrils creeping from beneath, wrapping around my tires and digging into the earth-like roots. Looking up, I froze in place. There was Mr. Thompson, inches away, that same smile stretched across his face, wild approval dancing in his eyes. "It's just a spot," he whispered, voice smooth and filled with eager resonance. In that moment, I understood what I'd become, just another lost soul to nourish his insatiable craving for dominance over life, held captive with the realization that the only way to escape this otherworldly nightmare would be to surrender my life as a tribute, the very sacrifice that would grant him what he sought. And as he leaned closer, inviting me deeper into the darkness, I screamed internally, realizing I was trapped in a game with no escape, with no answers. AITA for asking him not to park in my spot? It turns out that in this twisted web of existence, sometimes the rules aren't just for parking spaces, they're about survival. AITA for suggesting my teacher host my son's party at her house? It all started innocently enough. My son Ethan had turned 8, and in the excitement of planning his birthday party, I wanted to make it unforgettable. After all, this was the age where friendships began to solidify, and I wanted Ethan to feel special. I had toyed with the idea of renting a hall or throwing a backyard barbecue, but nothing felt quite right. It needed a personal touch, something more intimate. That's when I remembered Ms. Keller, Ethan's 3rd-grade teacher, who had been nothing short of extraordinary. She had a way of bringing magic into mundane lessons, turning math classes into treasure hunts and history into exciting adventures, and I thought, why not? It was a bit of a stretch, but her massive Victorian-style house, filled with books and nooks, could be the perfect backdrop for a meaningful gathering. I approached her after school one day, my heart pounding in my chest, and suggested it as a wild idea. To my surprise, she considered it. Her smile softened into something more contemplative, as she brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear and nodded thoughtfully, but she never agreed. Weeks passed, and the conversation slipped from memory until I received a text from her, asking if I wanted to meet for coffee, where she revealed she had been thinking about hosting the party at her house after all, citing how her own children loved the space. My heart soared. It was the answer I'd dreamed of, and I quickly agreed. The days leading up to the party were filled with excitement and anticipation. Every time Ethan smiled or laughed, I felt like I was on top of the world, relishing the fact that my crazy idea had manifested into reality. Then, the night of the party came. The kids flooded into Ms. Keller's grand home. Laughter echoed through her hallways, filled with the sweet scent of homemade cookies and the sound of balloons popping. I was caught up in a whirlwind of joy, glancing at Ms. Keller, who seemed to glide effortlessly between the children, her voice a gentle breeze among the giggles, until everything took a strange turn. Around 9, when half the kids were exhausted, I noticed Ethan drifting toward the basement door, which was slightly ajar, hesitant fingers reaching for the handle. "Ethan, no." I called out, the warning tearing from my lips as I rushed toward him, a sudden chill creeping into my veins. Ms. Keller was right behind me, her smile flickering as she gently reprimanded him, offering a promise of games and laughter above, but the glint in her eyes turned steely for the briefest second, sending a shiver crawling up my spine. I dismissed the incident, attributing my unease to exhaustion, and helped set up the cake. But the atmosphere thickened as the night wore on, the joyous laughter stagnant against an ill wind that seemed to seep in from nowhere. I watched as one by one, the children began to act strangely. They would pause mid-laugh, eyes wide as if something had whispered their names. The cake remained untouched, and the adults murmured amongst themselves, glancing nervously at the basement door that somehow drew attention like a gaping maw ready to swallow the unwary. It creaked open again, and I lost my breath when I saw tiny shadows moving in the dimness, figures that looked like children but were all wrong, limbs out of proportion, faces stretched or twisted in unnatural ways. One child, my neighbor's son, stumbled back up the stairs and pointed a trembling finger toward the door, and I suddenly realized none of the kids had gone in, but rather, something had come out. Ms. Keller quickly ushered them away, her demeanor shifting, sternness painting her features. I was struck by a sense of dread deeper than fear. I fumbled for my phone, frantically attempting to call the police when Ms. Keller approached, an unsettling calm settling over her. "Everything's fine, really," she said, her voice smooth like honey but edged with steel. "Just let them play." Then she looked beyond me and smiled, but I could feel it, a wave of malevolence rolling off her as the basement door creaked open wider, and a chilling breeze clawed at my back. Panic bubbled up inside me as I gripped Ethan's arm and started toward the door, but the children were transfixed, eyes locked on the darkness below. "You're being silly," Ms. Keller whispered with a hint of irritation, glancing over at the basement while the lights flickered ominously. "They just want to play a game." I felt the icy grip of dread tighten around me. The playfulness of the party had warped into something grotesque, as if the children were entranced by the shadowed figures whispering promises they could not resist. I turned and bolted for the door, dragging Ethan with me, but behind me, I could hear Miss Keller's sweet voice laced with something sinister. "Ethan, we have so much more fun to have down here," she beckoned, her tone shifting like the wind, and everything in me screamed to flee. I yanked him toward the exit just as chaos erupted. The children screamed, not in delight but in pure terror as the twisted forms slinked further into the light, and the laughter turned into shrieks. I burst through the front door, practically tearing Ethan into the night as the darkness behind me stirred, shadows swirling like tempests through Ms. Keller's home. The last thing I saw before slamming the door shut was her eyes, two glimmering voids that seemed to absorb both light and life. We didn't stop running until we reached our car parked at the end of the street, panting and gasping as I shoved Ethan into the passenger seat, fumbling for my keys. It wasn't until we were far away, the glow of Miss Keller's charming house in the distance, that I dared to glance at him, and when I did, everything felt wrong. His eyes were wide, not with fear, but a strange, otherworldly calm, and I realized with dawning horror that he had begun to mimic the same expression I had seen on those twisted children. I glanced back at him, trying to shake off the terror, desperate to hold on to the warmth of normalcy, and as the night deepened around us, doubt crept in. Did I just ruin my son's birthday, or had I unwittingly invited something far worse? I shuddered thinking of Ms. Keller, now a blend of menace and charm, waiting at the edge of darkness for another innocent soul, and with each mile, a single thought screamed in my mind: was this all my fault? Growing up, I always knew I was different from the other kids in my town. While most families seemed whole and uncomplicated, my reality was a patchwork quilt of half-truths and familial tensions, my parents' marriage a fragile thing that shattered when I was just 15. It was then that my mom revealed to me the existence of my half-sister, Lily, a product of my dad's affair, and though I initially felt a strange sort of sympathy for her, that empathy twisted and hardened as years went by. With my mother constantly torn between her loyalty to our bloodline and the shame her husband's infidelity brought upon us, she began to favor Lily, at least in the subtler, unmeasured ways: an extra scoop of ice cream at parties, bonus minutes spent in delighted conversation that I never seemed to earn. It came to a head when my mother decided to gift Lily our family's most prized heirloom, a delicate silver necklace adorned with a single emerald, which had belonged to my grandmother and was said to carry the blessings of strength and resilience. That summer evening, as I stood there aghast, Lily grinning in delighted astonishment while my heart pounded like a war drum echoing betrayal through my veins, I felt my chest constrict with such a mix of emotions: rage, contempt, and something jaggedly sharp that I'd only admit to myself years later: a deep, gnawing sense of loss. I told her she didn't deserve it, the words spilling out of my mouth like venom, and for a moment the air was thick with a silence that amplified the quiet sobs my mother stifled. In an instant, Lily's joy was crushed under the weight of my accusation, her face paling. "You don't even know me," she retorted, but the words cut deeper than any knife, and for a fleeting moment, I saw irritation fuse with sadness in her eyes. Everything spiraled after that. My mom refused to talk to me, her disappointment a tangible cloud that enveloped our home, wrapping itself so tightly around me that I suffocated in shame. I convinced myself I was right, that I was standing up for the sanctity of our family line, not to mention my grandmother's memory, but every day that dragged into weeks left a bitter residue on my soul, and Lily was the ghost haunting me wherever I went until one nameless, starlit night I found myself on my way to meet her, a stupid impulse driving me forward like a moth to a flame, thinking maybe, just maybe, I could mend the frayed edges of the relationship I sabotaged so recklessly. Lily lived in an old Victorian that smelled of mildew and neglect, her laughter once light-hearted now tinged with a hardness that spoke of years spent being a shadow, always outshined by a bone-deep allure of a necklace she knew would never belong to her. She opened the door with hesitation, and I noticed the way her eyes flickered with a cocktail of surprise and cautious hope. "What do you want?" she asked, but the sharpness of her tone melted the moment she caught sight of the little box I held closely, the very one my mother had used to gift her that damned necklace. "I'm sorry," I stuttered, feeling the weight of my words evaporate in the cool night air. "I wanted you to have it, because it's not the necklace that matters, it's what it represents, the love and connection that comes with it." Yet as I held out the small box, Lily's expression shifted, confusion wrinkles furrowing her brow. "You're just saying that because of Mom," she whispered, bitterness flowing through every syllable, making me realize how wrong I was to believe that a simple apology would eclipse the years of resentment we shared. But then, she surprised me, her eyes softening as she slowly reached for the box, delicate fingers trembling, and I felt a warm swell in my chest. For a moment, we exchanged something sacred, a flicker of that sisterly bond that had been buried in the rubble of our complicated heritage. But in the back of my mind, a plaguing thought lingered: what if the real ghost that was haunting me wasn't the fractured family ties but rather what lay inside that necklace box? As the night unfolded, and shadows danced across her living room, something broke in me when I finally said, "It's cursed." Lily laughed, a sound that echoed against the walls, disbelief sparkling in her eyes, but I persisted, recounting the whispers I'd heard, the warnings passed down through years, that the necklace held a dark secret. My grandmother had insisted on wearing it every single day until her last breath, her slow decline a shadowed testimony to its malevolence. That revelation hung in the air like a lightning storm, and I hoped the curse would shatter the moment, expose any fragile connection we had. But when Lily pulled the necklace from its velvet resting place, I swear I felt the temperature drop as darkness unfurled around us, an unsettling whisper brushing through the air, weaving itself through the tension. "You think I can't handle it?" she challenged, heart blazing with defiance, and my stomach dropped as I caught her twisting the delicate chain around her neck, the emerald glimmering ominously at the hollow of her throat. The lights flickered, shadows growing long and distorted, stretching across the room, and I felt as if I was standing at the edge of a precipice as dread unfurled like a storm. I approached her cautiously, my heart racing, assuring her it was just an old wives' tale, but the moment she pressed her fingertips against the cool emerald, my voice was drowned out by a rumble, the ground beneath us trembling. Suddenly, with a crash, the windows shattered violently, a gust of icy wind rushing in, a fury unleashed. I screamed for her to take it off, but she stood there, frozen, eyes wide with a mix of terror and exhilaration, a new kind of laughter spilling from her lips that sent chills down my spine. In that instant, I knew we were no longer searching for forgiveness, nor sisterhood, but rather that darkness was claiming her, just as it had claimed our grandmother. The necklace now tangled around her like a malevolent snake, it began to glow with an ethereal light, and as the horrifying truth dawned on me, I realized I didn't just destroy our family's legacy, I unleashed a haunting that neither of us could escape. It was too late for apologies now. With a heartbreaking resolve, I rushed towards her, desperate to rip it away, but unearthly sounds erupted from the shadows, screeching and wailing, a cacophony promising suffering, promising that we had both become part of something far beyond our understanding. The necklace glowed brighter, swallowing her whole as Lily screamed, an echo of anger, fear, and, above all, despair, before she simply vanished, the necklace spiraling into darkness as my heart shattered. I stumbled back, gasping, the world around me disassembling into chaos as I realized, the truth was never about deserving the necklace, it was about the curse that tethered us both to the ghosts of our past, and in my heart, I knew I would forever carry the weight of what happened that night, a sister still lost to the shadows, the necklace a constant reminder that in this twisted story, no one was truly innocent and I was left haunted by the question, Ida, for telling my half-sister she didn't deserve my mom's necklace? Last summer, my friend Brian dared me to jump on his new trampoline after school, but I just shrugged it off, claiming I wasn't in the mood. Honestly, I felt a strange unease whenever I went near it, as if it were more of a portal than a simple backyard attraction. Brian was relentless, teasing me about being scared and insisting that it was perfectly safe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. You see, he had gotten that trampoline the previous weekend, almost impulsively, after attending a yard sale that offered it for a steal because the family was moving away quickly. As I tried to walk away from his persistent offers, I overheard Brian mention something about how the trampoline seemed alive to his little brother, Timmy, who was only 5 and had already developed this eerie attachment to it. I chuckled nervously, brushing off the remark, but later that night, I heard Timmy's laughter drifting into my window, and the sound was oddly distorted, a kind of echoing giggle that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. When I told Brian about it the next day, he downplayed it, saying Timmy was just being a kid. Still, I couldn't help but remember the murmurings I had heard from the other kids at school, whispers about the last owners of that trampoline, the couple who vanished without a trace, leaving their house in disarray and their yard littered with the remnants of a normal family life. As days turned into weeks, and each day brought an increasing intensity of Timmy's obsession with the trampoline, I became more uneasy. I could often see him out there, springing into the air, laughing uncontrollably as if the trampoline was buoying him to new heights of joy. But every now and then, he would stop mid-jump, tilting his head as if listening to something from the shadows of their large oak tree. Finally, one late afternoon, I relented and agreed to join Brian and Timmy. As I climbed onto the trampoline, the surface felt unnaturally warm under my feet, almost pulsing, like it had a heartbeat. I tried to force a smile, bouncing gently, but that sensation of unease returned tenfold. It wasn't fear of falling, it was an instinctive dread that clawed at my stomach, warning me to get out before it was too late. Within minutes, Timmy returned to jumping, his laughter now edging towards something sinister. He would occasionally stop, staring wide-eyed at the ground, and that's when it hit me. I couldn't quite tell if he was laughing or if he was being called to something I couldn't see, a siren song that made him float just a little too close to the edge of sanity. That night, I lay in my bed, tossing and turning, unable to shake the feeling that the trampoline had changed something in Timmy. It wasn't just a plaything anymore. I can't explain it rationally, but I started having dreams, vivid and grotesque, dreams of wide-open spaces and crooked shadows, of children jumping in circles, their laughter resonating into an empty abyss. I woke in a cold sweat, and when I glanced out the window, there was Timmy again, bouncing on the trampoline beneath the pallid light of the moon, but this time, it was just him, alone, with that faint aura of something in the air, a palpable tension simmering beneath the surface. By the end of that week, Timmy's parents pulled him away from the trampoline, claiming it was time for bed. But I knew better. I could see how the glow of the moonlight dimmed to a dull hue, the energy changing palpably as their home became quieter. The very next morning, though, I was jolted awake by the sound of frantic knocks on my door. It was Brian, panting and wide-eyed. He said Timmy had vanished from his room, and the last time anyone saw him, he had been headed toward the trampoline. My heart raced as we sprinted down the street, the sun glaring down unforgivingly, making our urgency feel desperate. As we neared the house, I could sense an oppressive aura surrounding that backyard, as if the air itself was warning me. We found Timmy standing still on the trampoline, fully awake, staring deeply into the air above him. Brian called out to him, but there was no response. He didn't even blink. I felt paralyzed. The laughter from earlier was gone, replaced with a heavy silence that froze the bone. I grabbed Brian and pulled him back as I gasped for breath. I suddenly realized that Timmy looked older, his little face somehow transformed by the week's events. Then, just like that, he jumped. And kept going. Higher and higher, defying all laws of gravity, until he reached an impossible altitude, hovering suspended in midair with a glint of wild joy in his eyes, a dark and glittering promise that horrified me. "Timmy, get down," Brian shouted in desperation as I felt my stomach drop. Something was terribly wrong. Timmy turned and held out a tiny hand, as if inviting us to join him in that eerie state of bliss, but it was too late. Before we could comprehend what was happening, he was swallowed by a cloud of shadows that erupted from the edges of the trampoline, swallowing the sunlight and everything with it, leaving us standing breathless on a hollow lot, gasping at the absence of laughter where there once was pure childhood joy. I was left haunted by the thought that I had refused to jump that day, that despite my instincts screaming at me to stay away from that thing, I did nothing to protect Timmy. I watched as Brian collapsed to his knees, screaming for his brother in desperation, while I stood rooted on the ground, knowing the truth that I could never share, that sometimes, the thrill of the jump is a gateway to something darker, something that doesn't want to be found. Weeks passed, but the trampoline remained there, a grim reminder of our stupidity, our refusal to listen to instinct rather than the shrieking laughter of a child that felt all too inviting. To this day, I wonder if giving in would have turned the tides, if perhaps Timmy and I could have escape those sinister depths together, but now, all I hear is the echo of his laughter from the lifeless backyard, making me question, was I truly the idiot for not jumping on that trampoline? When I was a little girl, I dreamt of my wedding day with a fervor that would make even the most hard-hearted cynical adult roll their eyes, and if you had asked me then, I would have told you that my dream dress was a breathtaking pink gown, the kind that twirled like cotton candy beneath layered lights at sunset. Fast forward to my engagement, and my fiancé, Derek, was everything I could ask for. His smile lit up my world, and his laughter felt like home. But when I finally unveiled my cherished vision of a pink wedding dress to him, the look on Derek's face fell faster than I could catch it. He chuckled, which only deepened the crease across his brow. I pictured white, you know. Traditional. For the photos. As if my heart hadn't already begun to sink, I tried to brush off his hesitation, assuring him that love was what mattered most, and pink could be the essence of our shared joy. I revisited the boutique alone, the walls decorated in thousands of hues of white, and there, hanging like a forgotten story, was my original vision, a delicate pink dress, with a satin underlay that shimmered like the dawn. I slipped it on and stood before the mirror, and for the briefest moment, I felt perfect. I chose to go ahead with what my heart desired and marked the day with pink every step of the way, a pink cake, pink flowers, even pink shoes. What should have been a joyful time took a perilous turn when I announced those plans at our engagement party, where friends and family gathered, the city skyline glowing behind them. Family members gave polite claps, but I noticed my mother's jaw tighten and my grandmother's eyes narrow. What happened to the beautiful white wedding dresses? My mother questioned, her tone dripping with disapproval. It felt as if the air thickened, my smile wavering under the weight of their stares. Derek, after lagging behind with a muted expression, pulled me aside later, voicing his concerns in a hushed whisper, words about tradition and expectations spilling forth, drowning me in regret. "You know it's important to my family, right?" The doubt nestled itself in my stomach like a lead weight. My heart raced as he tried to convince me that I should reconsider, but it was too late to turn back. I was headfirst submerged in a sea of satin pink and deep disappointment. I had visions of our special day twisting like a terrifying dream I couldn't wake from, and the anxiety seeped into the planning, igniting late-night arguments that pushed him away from me instead of drawing us closer. The week before the wedding loomed like a storm cloud, the colors clashed so vividly with the black and white portrait of my future in-law's expectations. I couldn't sleep, the pink parasol and blush decorations filling every corner of my mind like quicksand. It was like a haunting chorus, and just before I drifted into a restless sleep, I found myself centered once more, a dreamlike image of walking down an aisle of happiness. All that mattered was our love and not the color of my dress. Then, on the day before the wedding, I received a message from my brother. "Mom and Dad are fighting. It's bad." A wave of dread washed over me as I found myself torn between my loyalty to my family and my heart's desire. The chasm widened between my decisions, and on the fateful morning, I donned my pink dress alone in the hotel suite, my mother's disapproval echoing like a ghost trapped between and among all the swirling laughter of pre-wedding chaos. The sight of myself sent adrenaline rushing through my veins. I did look beautiful. As the ceremony began, however, I spotted Derek's family, shoulders rigid and jaws tight. My heart sank further with every step that carried me into their line of sight. Their eyes, void of understanding, chased away the joyful spark I had longed for. By the time we exchanged vows in front of our loved ones, I felt a churning pit of anxiety in my stomach. I wished for one person to embrace me and validate my choices, and yet I found only silence from my family's corner. The flush of embarrassment was invaded further, creeping in like vines on ancient stone. After the ceremony, as we danced surrounded by a bittersweet haze of joy and resentment, my grandmother confronted me about my foolhardiness. "You won't honor tradition? On a day meant to bind your families?" Her words were like shards of glass, and I fought the urge to scream. I tried to defend my actions, a flimsy paper boat riding the turbulent waves of emotion, and soon the reception spiraled into chaos. Derek's voice pierced through the crowd, a mix of frustration and disappointment mirrored in his eyes as I stood before my family and his, my pink dress like bandages on wounds that would never heal. The noise blurred into a cacophony of judgment and misunderstanding, laughter stained with unceremonious rejection, and in that moment, I felt a distinct fracture forming. The tension thickened so much that it became impossible to navigate. The phone rang, breaking the anguished silence that shifted our worlds into turmoil. My father, voice tremulous, came hurtling into the room. "You need to come home. Now." Panic rose within me, as dread settled deep in my bones, an omen I couldn't escape. I thought about that pink dress, now drenched in symbolic blood. What was a celebration had become a battleground, leaving behind only the ruins of my dreams hanging like broken glass. When Derek saw the fear flashing in my eyes, he took my hand, pulling us away from their judging glares. "We'll make this right," he whispered, but I had no idea what that meant, whether our love could withstand the chaos we had unleashed. Yet a sliver of hope pierced through the shadows as we stepped beyond the threshold of acceptance and rejection, the pink fabric swirling around me, a whirlwind of sorrow and love intertwined. In those moments filled with disbelief, it became painfully clear that weddings shouldn't be a battlefield, yet here we found Ourselves entrenched, now a question ignited within, AITA for drama over a pink wedding dress? As I processed the fallout creeping into our lives, one thing was certain: it would take more than a color to define the love we were scrambling to salvage. AITA for using the word consent against my mother? I never thought I'd find myself typing this on a late Tuesday night, but here I am, heart racing, fingers trembling on the keyboard, desperate for some semblance of understanding about what just transpired in my life. It all started when I decided to visit my parents for the weekend. I hadn't been home in months, and I could sense my mom's disdain through the intermittent phone calls I received, filled with thinly veiled remarks about how I'd just forgotten about them. So, with a mix of guilt and nostalgia, I packed my bags and drove the 2 hours back to the house I grew up in, the place that held a billion memories, both good and bad. As I pulled into the driveway, a chill ran down my spine, but I shrugged it off as anxiety. After all, who really wants to discuss their life choices over dinner? My mom greeted me with her usual overbearing affection, hugging me tightly, her perfume cloying yet familiar, and I felt the knot of tension in my stomach slowly start to unravel. We chatted over dinner, the conversation light and predictable, until the topic shifted to my love life, a subject my mother tends to tackle using a hammer instead of a scalpel. She pressed me, asked questions I didn't want to answer, and her probing took on a sharp edge that I eventually pushed back against. That's when I uttered the word consent. It slipped out during an argument after she told me to pick better partners. I just couldn't take her lecture anymore. I said something like, "Mom, it's my life. I get to choose who I want to be with, and I need your consent to make me feel worthy." It wasn't meant to hurt her, but the air changed in an instant. Her face darkened, a look I had never seen before, as if I had slammed a door in her face, a door I didn't even know existed until that moment. Silence stretched like a rubber band ready to snap, and I could feel my heart thudding in my chest. My mother's eyes shimmered with a complex blend of hurt and rage, and she took a step back, her breath hitching as if someone had stolen the air from her lungs. I couldn't comprehend what had happened. All I knew was that I had crossed a line that I hadn't even known was there. It was a conversation spiraling completely out of control, and before I could backtrack or even apologize, she screamed. "You think you can use that word against me? You think I don't know what consent means? I didn't give birth to you just for you to throw it back in my face." I was taken aback, utterly stunned. Her face had grown pale, her features tightly coiled like a snake preparing to strike. In that moment, I felt a mix of anger and defiance as I shot back, "I'm just saying that consent goes both ways, Mom. You can't control my life, and this guilt trip is not what healthy parenting looks like." The tension suffocated the room, and that storm-clouded silence fell over us again, thick with resentment and suppressed emotions. I half expected her to storm out, to slam a door, but she stood there, trembling, looking like a portrait of shattered pride. It became painfully clear that this had triggered something deeper, something hidden beneath layers of our past. So I did what I thought was right, hoping to take the narrative back into my hands. I reached out, trying to connect, desperate to clear the air. "Mom, I didn't mean it like that," I pleaded, but my words were met with a blank stare, and suddenly she whispered a name that sent a shockwave through my body, my grandmother's. She used to say consent is why I had to fight for you, why I had to endure pain, so you could be free. Those words felt like ice piercing through my veins. It was like she had opened a door I never knew existed. My grandmother had always been a mysterious figure, a woman who had endured much and left behind stories that were always shrouded in whispers. I searched my mother's face for any hint of explanation, but instead, she crumbled into tears and I watched, horrified, as years of unspoken grievances poured out. She started to tell me about her childhood, how my grandmother had made choices that had shackled her to an unhappy marriage and a life of regret, all born from a warped sense of broken consent she could never escape, and I sat there, frozen, overwhelmed by sadness for a past I couldn't touch. "I was supposed to be your protector," she sobbed, "but it all feels so twisted. I never wanted you to feel the same pain I did." In an instant, I realized the true weight of what I had said. Our entire lives were entangled in these invisible threads, stretching across generations. It wasn't just about our conversation anymore, it was history echoing through the walls of our family home. It became clear that the word consent had opened a Pandora's box of unhealed wounds and buried sorrows. I thought I was just standing up for myself, but instead, I was confronting a legacy of pain I never fully understood. I held her tightly, both of us enveloped in tears, and for the first time, we acknowledged the silent cries of our past. But even within that embrace, a part of me knew that this revelation wouldn't be the end. It was just the beginning of a much longer journey we would have to navigate together, facing truths that could rip families apart or, maybe, for the first time, bring us closer. So, now I sit here questioning myself, wondering, Ada? Part of me feels guilt for awakening this dark past in my mother, another part knows if I hadn't said anything, we may have remained stuck in our silence. Maybe, in breaking the chain, I was finally breaking free. My heart pounded in my chest like a drum as I stood at the edge of our yard, peering through the trees at the gathering across the street where my younger sister and her friends threw what they called a party. It wasn't the kind of party filled with balloons and cake, it was dark and chaotic, the flickering glow of a cheap disco light battling against the encroaching shadows of twilight. I had always been the responsible one, the one who stayed inside and studied while my sister, Mia, had been allowed to explore the edges of that reckless freedom. But as I listened to their laughter thick with smoke and heard the muffled beats of music that felt too loud for our suburban neighborhood, a knot of dread twisted in my stomach. When I accidentally overheard snippets of their conversations just a few nights before, a part of me wanted to look away, pretend I didn't hear them boast about sneaking out, drinking, and trying drugs, things I never thought Mia would dare to touch. But every time I thought about ignoring it, I pictured the way our mother would break if something happened to Mia, and the moral weight that pressed down on me was suffocating. I had to make a choice. So, I did what I thought was right, and I slipped through the door, my palms clammy against the cold brass knob, and I told our mother everything. At first, she didn't believe me, perhaps she couldn't bear to think that our sweet Mia, her golden child, could stoop to such depths. I led her to the window, hoping this time she would listen, and with each step toward that gathering, I felt the ground beneath me shift, the air growing heavy with anticipation for both of us. The moment she turned pale and I saw her fists clench, I knew I'd made the right choice. But the reality we stepped into was nothing short of catastrophic. Mia's laughter vanished into the night as Mom stormed over to where they were dancing, and I wished I could feel as invincible as they seemed. When Mom confronted her friends, I watched the chaos unfold, their innocence bled away, replaced by guilt, as they scattered like skittles dropped on asphalt. Mia, shattered and furious, faced our mother the way a wild animal afraid for its life might confront a hunter. What followed was a symphony of screaming that rattled the very windows, a confrontation that carved itself into the fabric of our family. My sister was kicked out of the house that night, a decision permeated with shame playing across my mother's face like a veil. The last time I saw Mia, she stood at the door, eyes locked onto mine, and I dared not look away. Could I, the one who had always protected her, really be the monster who caused all this? Was I, in fact, an awful person for looking out for her? Guilt ate at me for days following the incident, but there was also a creeping sense of fear lingering in the corners of my mind. As the days melted into weeks, Mia's absence turned our home into a hollow shell. Our mother's grief manifested in silence, each meal a reminder of the laughter that once filled the air. I received mixed messages from everyone. Friends at school whispered their pity while my teachers offered me haunting looks that spoke volumes, as if they miraculously knew my hand in the fray. I thought about reaching out to Mia, but the shame rooted me in place, tightening every nerve and leaving me wondering if I had made a dreadful mistake. One night, when I couldn't bear the haunting guilt any longer, I decided to text Mia, an olive branch, a feeble apology hidden behind layers of regret. But instead of the expected "I miss you" or "I understand," she simply replied, "You have no idea what you've done." Those words slashed through my chest. I half expected a sob fest but instead got cold dread that coiled within me. For weeks, I left my phone on my bed, too frightened to reach out again, until one day when I received an unexpected voicemail. "You'll pay for this," she snarled, her voice dripping with malice, warped and unrecognizable. From that moment on, the atmosphere shifted. I felt eyes on me, shadows lurking just behind my shoulders. I could hear the whisper of Mia's name on the wind whenever I walked to school, could sense the malicious energy in the air that followed me home. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, heart racing, convinced Mia had turned into something more sinister, a specter lurking just beyond my vision, waiting for the right moment to pounce. Then, the knocks started, quiet at first but building into furious strikes that made me jump. Each time I opened the door, my heart would leap, praying it was merely a neighbor or the pizza delivery guy, but always hoping to see her face, until one evening, it was my mother who answered the door, forcing a grin, sagging under the weight of her grief. That night, the silence deepened, a heavy blanket pressing over our home, and I could swear I heard Mia's laughter echoing off the walls in the dead of night. The weeks dragged on, my anxiety spiraled, until I could no longer tell when I was awake or dreaming. Then came the night of terror, an unspeakable thing that broke through the stillness of our home. It awakened me from a restless sleep, a piercing shriek echoing like steel scraping against stone. I bolted up, breath hitched in my throat, heart pounding as I grabbed my phone, praying it wasn't Mia, that she hadn't returned to exact her revenge. I opened the door a crack, shadows danced under the moonlight, and creeping dread slid into my bones. As I stepped into the hallway, the familiar scent of smoke clawed at my throat, reminding me of those forgotten nights by the tree across the street. What I found at the end was nothing I could have ever imagined. Mia stood there, features twisted in rage, surrounded by her friends, an odd gathering that felt both foreign and familiar in a way I couldn't comprehend. Except now, they wore masks, faces twisted in grotesque expressions, and when they turned to me, the air filled with chilling laughter that echoed my wildest fears, inhuman, mocking. "You should have left us alone," Mia hissed, her voice slipping through the masks of her friends, haunting and venomous. I tried to back away, but a force pulled me forward, chaotic energy bubbling in the air, vibrating through my bones, my heart racing in fear. "What do you want?" I stammered, but the swirling laughter grew louder, drowning out my voice and whispering, "It's your fault, you wanted this." In that moment, I realized the truth planted firmly in the pit of my stomach. I didn't just lose my sister that night, I had lost myself as well. The love I thought could conquer all had twisted into something malevolent, and I was left in a game I never volunteered to play. As the laughter soared, crescendoing into a feral din that shattered the walls of my sanity, frantic thoughts raced through my mind. Were they all just figments of my imagination? But the unmistakable truth clamped around my throat like a vice. I had brought this darkness upon both our lives. I could hear them chanting, words that stole the warmth from my soul, and at that moment, I understood their true nature. They were no longer just me as friends, they were something darker, something that thrived in the shadows I had feared all along. I collapsed to my knees, the weight of regret and despair suffocating, and there, in the dim light of the hallway, I realized not just who Mia had become, but also who I had become, a puppet on strings of guilt. As the laughter enveloped me, each teasing taunt whispered back memories of warmth, love, and laughter, replaced now by darkness, echoing indefinitely against the walls of our broken home. In that moment of clarity, I knew it was too late to save her, and too late to save myself. I always thought my family was strange, but I never expected that the looming shadow of my father's estate would unravel everything I thought I knew about loyalty, love, and sanity. My father, still alive but battling a relentless illness that had reduced him to a mere ghost of the man he once was, owned a sprawling piece of land, a crumbling farmhouse with more history than charm, and a collection of oddities that filled every nook and cranny of the place. After years of being an outcast in my own family, my brother Alex returned with a gleam in his eye and a desperate need for money, which he insisted my father should have already divided. "He won't need it after he's gone," he told me one night as the shadows gathered in the corners of our dimly lit living room. I felt an odd chill, not from the cold, but from the look in his eyes that seemed almost predatory. He wanted me to agree to sell a portion of our father's land, a decision I found ghastly. I couldn't bear the thought of discussing finances so soon. My father was still with us, albeit slipping away by the day. "You're being selfish," Alex snapped, his voice tinged with a venom that echoed through the stillness. I could hear my father's labored breathing from the next room, a constant reminder that he was fighting his own battles, and in the throes of denial, I clung to what little was left of our family unit. The days that followed grew darker, with my brother returning at odd hours, constantly trying to charm me into seeing things his way, all the while casting angry glances at our father, as if the old man's mere existence was a blight on his plans. Conflicted, I found myself venturing into the attic to escape the familial tension, combing through dusty boxes filled with fragmented memories, discovering strange letters, some of them detailing occult practices that seemed out of place among my father's mundane possessions. Flickering candlelight from an old lantern illuminated my father's poetry, haunting verses about loss and existence, which sent chills down my spine, making me question not just Alex's motives but the very nature of what it means to own something so deeply personal. Then came the night everything changed. I woke to the sound of chanting, low and insidious, echoing through the halls of the farmhouse. In a daze, I stumbled down the creaky stairs, compelled by some unseen force to investigate. The living room was bathed in an eerie glow. Alex stood at the center, surrounded by candles casting elongated shadows that writhed against the walls like living things. His eyes were unfocused, a manic glint shimmering as he gripped a large, intricately carved pentacle that had once belonged to our father, the very emblem of what was left of our family legacy. "You don't understand what's at stake," he pleaded, a frenzy edging his voice as if he were channeling some otherworldly energy. "The estate belongs to us, but not for long if he passes. I need you to help me." Before I could respond, a low thrum reverberated from the floor beneath us, intensifying. My father's anguished groans wafted through the air, merging with the incantations that spilled from my brother's lips, forming a grotesque echo vibrating through my very bones. Paralyzed by fear, I finally found my voice, screaming at Alex to stop, but the words were lost in the hollow space as the lights flickered and the shadows convulsed. It was then that I saw it, the grotesque, distorted face of our father reflected in the window, lips moving in silent horror as if he were begging for release from the grip of his son's madness. With a surge of adrenaline, I lunged for the pentacle, desperately yanking it from Alex's grasp, its edges burning against my palm. The moment I touched it, reality split apart like brittle glass. A cacophony erupted in the room, a sound that scraped the insides of my skull. I was thrown back, landing hard against the wooden floor, breath knocked from my lungs, as shadows swarmed over me with suffocating wrath, eager to consume. The last thing I remember was the sight of Alex, eyes wide with terror, unsure whether to flee or fight against the amalgamation of forces we had unleashed. When I returned to consciousness, the house felt different, heavier, charged with an anxiety I couldn't place. I scrambled to my feet, scanning the room as frail wisps of the past whispered through the air, muddled memories piercing the haze. I found my father in his bed, gasping, the lines on his face deepening as if aged by decades in just hours. Desperate to salvage what remained of my family, I pleaded with him for answers, for something to cling to that wasn't shrouded in fear. Instead, he gripped my hand with surprising strength, a grave expression washing over his features, as he confessed dark family secrets, the endless cycle of greed and loss, a dreadful once-committed pact stretching back generations that led to despair, forever binding us to that estate. My brother had stumbled upon that darkness, and though he thought he could wield it, the truth was evil wasn't meant to be controlled. I raced to find Alex, but he was gone. The house echoed with madness coursing through its walls, crawling in every shadow and corner. I could feel the energy swirling around me, wrapping tighter as though the very land was rejecting me for refusing to play into its sinister game. Alone, forbidden even to call for help, I was left to confront what had transpired, the eerie weight of despair pressing down like an anchor to the abyss. My only choice was to confront the terrifying legacy of my lineage, but I wouldn't make the same mistakes. I resolved to protect my father's estate, to honor his last wishes, even if that meant facing the darkness alone, because I finally understood. Before any of it was mine, it belonged to the shadows beneath the surface, and they would only grow stronger if I followed my brother down that road. AITA for refusing to sell my father's estate and distribute the money? Maybe. But when your brother dances with devils, walking away might just be the only way to survive. When I first moved into my tiny 2-bedroom apartment with Clara, I was excited to finally have a place of my own, an escape from the oppressive atmosphere of my childhood home. Clara was friendly and welcoming, and we bonded over our shared love of late-night baking marathons and binge-watching true crime documentaries. Everything was great until one evening, when I got home late after a long shift at the diner and decided to whip up a batch of cookies to unwind. The smell of chocolate chip dough rising in the oven felt like home, familiar and comforting, but just as I pulled the tray out, Clara's voice cut through the sweetness of the moment. "Can we talk?" she asked, her expression serious, which struck me as odd. I set the warm cookies on the cooling rack and sat down at the small kitchen table, eager to hear what was bothering her. Clara lowered her voice, as if someone might overhear us, and said, "I need you to promise me you won't use the oven again." My heart dropped, the request clawed at my mind, a bone-chilling whisper of unreasonableness. "What? Why?" I asked, incredulous. You just can't," she insisted, her voice trembling slightly. Every fiber of my being wanted to dismiss her, but my curiosity got the better of me. "Is this about your weird family back home?" I pressed, remembering the odd traits she'd shared, like her great-grandfather's obsession with farming the land even after moving to the city. Clara's gaze suddenly turned distant, like a clock unwinding. "It's for your own good," she said quietly, and that's when I noticed how her hands were clenched into tight fists, her knuckles white against the faded oak of the table. I tried to reason with her, tell her that in all my previous apartments, I'd always used the oven, it was essential, the heart of my culinary dreams. But Clara remained firm, almost fearful. So, night after night, I reluctantly complied. My meals became monotonous, leaning heavily toward microwave dinners and takeout, leaving the oven untouched and the rich aroma of baked goods locked away in my yearning heart. I could feel the tension building, so I decided to do some digging and looked through the boxes Clara had left unpacked since the move. I found an old, dust-covered cookbook bound in frayed leather that caught my attention, dog-eared and marked with strange symbols I didn't recognize. Flicking through pages, I discovered handwritten notes and a hurried scrawl that spoke of rituals, of family traditions lost to time, and warnings against the oven being a portal of sorts, a gateway for something sinister. That night, I tentatively approached Clara as she flicked through channels, eyes glazed, and asked her about the cookbook. Her face turned pale, she snatched it from my hands, growling, "You shouldn't have looked at that." I recoiled, and she suppressed a sob as if she were about to spill secrets wrought with anguish. "What is happening, Clara?" I urged, but she shook her head in the manner of a child being lectured, whispering about how the oven shouldn't be used, how it belonged to a legacy far darker than we could comprehend. As the days dragged on, wrapped in her escalating mania, I finally lost my patience. It was a Thursday night, and I needed to bake something, anything, to reclaim my sanity. I woke up in the dead of night with an insatiable hunger for something freshly baked. Quietly, I crept into the kitchen, adrenaline coursing through my veins, and leaned over the counter where my food scale and mixing bowls lay patiently. Ignoring my better judgment, I started to gather my ingredients. I turned the oven knob, feeling a sense of rebellion surge through me, and that beautiful glow flickered to life, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. As I mixed together the batter, I could have sworn I heard something in the distance, a whisper echoing from deep within that old cookbook. The moment my cookies started to brown, the shelves rattled under an invisible force. Confusion flooded my senses, maybe it was an earthquake, or perhaps Clara had returned. But as I peeked through the window into the deep ink of midnight, I saw her. She was standing in the darkness of the courtyard, her back to me, whispering in a language that was sharp and foreign. I felt the door swing open behind me, a gust of wind that carried Clara's scent, something floral yet cold, like autumn leaves. I spun around, heart pounding, only to find the oven door flung wide open, steam billowing out like ethereal smoke. As I leaned forward, horrified, I noticed that my beautifully baked cookies had transformed into grotesque, burnt shapes, almost as though they were alive, broken shells shrieking silently in my mind. A low growl reverberated from the oven, the temperature surged, and the shadows coalesced into a swirling mass. The realization hit me swiftly. Clara had been keeping me from using the oven for a reason, a warning cloaked in paranoia. I reached for the cookbook, my fingers trembling, but Clara appeared behind me, her face twisted, fury and sorrow etched into her features. "You weren't supposed to see," she shrieked, and as I turned, the shadows seemed to reach out, lunging toward her. She stumbled backward, nails clawing at the wooden floor, a scream pouring from her lips as the darkness enveloped her. I was frozen in shock as she was dragged into the abyss of the oven, the growls intensifying, final echoes of her terror haunting the air. I blinked and found myself alone, the kitchen illuminated eerily by the oven's light. The cookbook lay open on the table, words shifting like quicksand, warning me, never again. My heart raced as a burning rage ignited within me. Yet, the overwhelming dread remained. I staggered back, staring at the melted remnants of the cookies that felt like pieces of souls. I stumbled out of the kitchen, breath quickening, feeling Clara's absence like a chasm in my chest. I don't think I will ever truly understand what happened that night. Days passed, and I couldn't bring myself to open the oven again. I lived off cold meals, the silence echoing in the apartment, and every time I caught a glimpse of the cookbook, its call now tainted with dread, I felt a presence lurking within its pages. I've tried to move on, but whispers follow me, warning me that the oven's portal is still alive, a void waiting to swallow more. Now, every time I hear a knock on my door or see a shadow dart in the corner of my eye, I can't help but wonder if Clara is still out there. I still hear her voice sometimes, calling softly, begging for help against the darkness, a darkness I helped unleash by breaking a promise. So, here I am, Ida for wanting to use the oven, or is she still watching from whatever realm those shadows had taken her to, forever reminding me of what the oven truly holds? For years, I prided myself on my ability to endure my friend Clara's so-called quirky behavior, the kind that often left me cringing, but I insisted to myself that everyone has their oddities and I should be accepting, even if her antics made me uncomfortable. It was Clara's signature thing to speak her thoughts aloud about everyone around us. It often felt more like a brutal commentary rather than quirky charm. Just last week at the cafe, she loudly mused about how the barista's skin seemed to glow in that weird artificial light and how she wouldn't trade her unique red-streaked hair for anything in the world while the barista flinched from embarrassment. I silently cursed the day Clara just decided it was okay to play social commentator without any filter, but I almost let it slide until her antics escalated at a party for another friend's birthday. As the night went on, her quirkiness spiraled into something I could no longer ignore when she leaned over to a group of us and declared that she, frankly, believed that most people's opinions were below her own and even professed how she thought the birthday girl's dress made her look like a scuffed-up potato, as everyone squirmed in disbelief while Clara cackled at her own boldness, clearly oblivious to the growing discomfort around us. It was then that I snapped. Maybe it was the booze or the mounting unease, but I felt the pressure in my chest and the fire rising in my throat before I realized I had shouted out, "Ida, for telling you that your quirky behavior is just plain rude?" Silence fell over the room like an anvil crashing into a pool of water, and by the stunned expressions on our friends' faces, I was hit with an overwhelming sense of dread because I didn't know what would happen next. Clara's eyes turned to slits, and I could see a bewildered rage starting to bubble just beneath the surface as she processed what I had hurled at her. A tense moment passed before she laughed, but it was a sharp, humorless sound, cutting through the thick air like a knife. She straightened up, and the moment that followed was a cutthroat silence where every single one of our friends veered their eyes between us, unwilling to pick sides, but I could almost feel the ground shifting, the subtle change in energy that warned me I had awakened something far worse than awkwardness. Her voice dripped with venom as she launched into a tirade about how tired she was of people pretending to be happy and how incapable they were of being real, claiming that I was the one who needed to wake up and actually embrace the authenticity she so proudly represented. She painted me as the villain in my own story, shoving my character into a corner while she proclaimed herself as the fearless truth-teller, and everything spiraled from there. The rest of the party echoed her sentiments, turning their backs on me, and suddenly I found myself standing alone in the living room, humiliated while Clara reveled in her newfound role as the underdog champion of anti-niceties, and for a second, I found myself weighing every moment I had put up with her over the years. As I retreated to the bathroom, my heart thrumming wildly in my chest, I wiped my clammy hands on my jeans and stared at my reflection, feeling both relieved and tormented by my own impulsive outburst. Was I wrong? Regrettably, I couldn't shake this overwhelming cloud of guilt, knowing I might have misplaced my aggression towards her flippancy. The atmosphere outside was thick and moldy, mirroring the darkness brewing in my chest, but when I emerged to rejoin the throng of partygoers, something shifted in the air that arguably felt more sinister. Clara was still entertaining our friends, but something in her demeanor had soured. The edges of her smiles were sharp, and the way she was speaking had morphed into something unsettling, her eyes glinting with an unsettling mirth, and as if she drew strength from my moment of weakness, the comments she tossed flared deeper, aiming at our friends with precision, laced with an underlying current of malice that felt palpable. I tried to shake off the odd sensation creeping up behind me, a whispered warning flooding my gut, but as I left the party, I caught sight of Clara through the window, her gaze burning into my back as if she were carving my silhouette into the darkening night. Days passed, and each attempt to explain my perspective was met with confusion and rebuttal from mutual friends. They didn't see her for what she was. Desperate, I pulled one of the friends aside and asked if they noticed how my words had sparked a shift in Clara's behavior. His face paled, and he confessed that he'd seen Clara trying to turn seemingly innocent jokes into cruel barbs aimed at anyone who questioned her, that none of us were truly safe anymore. It felt like I had torn open a wound, exposing something dark and festering beneath the surface, and I wished I could just go back, apologize, and rewind time to prevent my slip from turning Clara's soiree into a breeding ground for her sadistic quips masquerading as humor. At that moment, Clara confronted me one last time before our mutual friends, and with chilling clarity, she stared down the crowded bar with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and asked me if I'd like to play a little game, and when I refused, she merely laughed, menacing and melodious, as she proclaimed how friendships are merely social contracts that can easily be broken. Suddenly the laughter around us fell like dead leaves, air thick with an unspoken terror that formed a pact in the back of my mind. I started getting messages, odd and cryptic from unknown numbers in the days that followed, with pictures of me snapped through blurry camera lenses. The first couple felt harmless, eerie at worst, that stirred up good old paranoia unlike anything I had felt previously. But when one simply read, "We are all friends until the mind cracks," then what? I realized that this wasn't merely Clara being annoyed, it was personal, a form of psychological warfare. It culminated that Friday night when I walked alone from my car, feeling the audience of unseen eyes on the back of my neck, creeping up my spine until I reached my front door. Yet I still felt the safety of my home was nothing more than an illusion when I heard Clara's familiar laugh from somewhere in the shadows. Alone in my room amidst the anxious shrill of my heart, I resolved to cut ties, rid myself of Clara and all that she encompassed. But just as the decision crumbled to form in my mind, another message pinged on my phone, this time an audio recording where I could hear Clara's voice gently whispering my name over and over again, and instead of a sense of relief, all I felt was dread. She knew where I lived. My heart raced, thoughts spiraled out of control as panic squeezed my chest tighter and the oppressive thunk of my pulse hammered in my ears. I had awakened something in her, transformed her into something dark and unrecognizable, and I realized, in that very moment, as I sat paralyzed and alone, a chilling truth sunk in. I had ignited a storm, and there was no turning back. The laughter would only grow louder. So tell me, was I wrong for attempting to call her out? Or did I unknowingly summon the very monster I attempted to escape? As the lights flickered overhead, a shadow danced along the wall, and I realized in horror that sometimes, the line between quirky and cruel is drawn in blood, and I was right in the center, and it wasn't over yet. I never thought I would reach the point where I had to cut my sister out of our weekly family dinners, but the moment she showed up with her son, Ethan, wearing a shirt that read "I don't care" and a scowl that could melt ice, I knew this was going to be different. Each week it had turned into a circus act, with Ethan running wild, climbing on furniture, and hollering about how everyone else was boring, while my sister, Lisa, just sat there scrolling through her phone, occasionally muttering half-hearted attempts to curb his antics. My parents would smile awkwardly, trying to ignore the chaos while I gritted my teeth, feeling every tentative attempt to make a meal or share a moment together slipping away like grains of sand. On one particularly disastrous evening, Ethan managed to grab a handful of mashed potatoes and fling them across the table, where they landed squarely in my dad's lap. Instead of mortification or an apology, Lisa just laughed it off, throwing her head back like this mess was some kind of comedy show. I snapped. "He needs boundaries, Lisa. You can't just let him act however he likes." Her laughter immediately turned into a glare as she shot back, "Really? Is that how you treat your kids? With such high expectations?" The accusation struck deep. I could feel my heart rate quicken, each beat echoing my growing frustration. So, after that night, or should I say debacle, I made a decision. I would stop inviting her until she could either parent her son or keep her opinions about how I raise my kids to herself. At first, it felt empowering, a way to reclaim my sanity, but then she began to retaliate, posting veiled messages on social media about the burden of judgment and family forgiveness. I felt a twinge of guilt each time I saw those whispers online, but my resolve was firm, like a wall against the tidal wave of her emotional blackmail. Weeks turned into months, and I convinced myself that I was the adult in the room, enforcing a boundary that had desperately needed reinforcing. But the longer I kept her at bay, the more I could feel something dark unraveling, like an uninvited guest finally revealing their true nature. I would wake up panicking some nights after dreaming of Ethan, screaming in a distorted version of my face, his laughter turning hollow as if he was mocking me for trying to carve out my sanctity. Then, one day, a message popped up on my phone. It was Lisa, a simple plea, "Can we talk? I miss you." I was caught off guard, my heart cautiously optimistic. Maybe she understood. Maybe this time would be different. I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop, the space buzzing with life, but the air between us felt suffocatingly thick. As she fidgeted with her cup, I braced myself, ready to hear her new understanding of parenthood or, at the very least, some acknowledgement of our strained relationship. Instead, she exploded, "You think you're better than me because you get to dictate who I can bring around? Ethan is my son, and he'll be how he wants to be, just like I will." I was taken aback by her intensity, like staring into a storm brewing on the horizon. My mind raced, thoughts tangled up as I fought the urge to defend myself. "I'm not better, Lisa. I'm just trying to make sure our family dinners don't feel like a war zone. I need you to step up." Instead of a resolution, we only escalated, voices raised until people were glancing over, expressions of concern flickering across their faces. In that moment, it was like the earth beneath me split open, revealing something dark and twisted, years of resentment, envy, and a complete misunderstanding of what family meant. The coffee shop felt stifling, too warm, too bright, and when she abruptly stood, throwing her half-empty cup on the table and storming out, I felt like I had broken something precious and irreversible. Days turned into weeks, and the silence hung heavily in the air, permeating my every thought until even my kids began to notice my despondence. One night, while tucking my son into bed, I overheard them whispering about how Aunt Lisa didn't love us anymore. Their innocent whispers pricked me, forcing me to face the nature of my estrangement. It was a pattern, a wound we were both festering that seemed impossible to stitch back together. The turning point came in the form of a phone call. It was my mother on the other end, sounding distraught. "It's Lisa. She's not doing well," she breathed heavily. I felt my stomach churn, a deep pit forming as I heard the cracks of her voice. It turned out Ethan had been caught stealing from a store, and in a fit of despair, he had lashed out at his mom, claiming that she never cared. The lines continued to blur, the good, the bad, my choices, her choices, and the children caught in the crossfire. Later that same day, I stood outside their apartment, the familiar knocking on the door filled with a weight I wasn't sure I could lift. When Lisa finally opened up, her eyes were red, and her cheeks streaked with tears. I expected anger or confusion, perhaps even a breath of pride in her parenting. Instead, she crumpled at the sight of me, relentless anguish welling up in her gaze as she fell into my arms. "I'm failing, and I don't know how to fix this." Those words hung heavy in the air, laced in heartbreak and desperation. In that moment, I realized that we weren't just fighting over dinner invitations, we were wrestling with our fears and insecurities as parents. And as I held her, my heart began to soften. We began a long conversation that felt like a true reckoning. Those dinners we had both associated with chaos transformed into a healing ground, a space for vulnerability and support rather than the judgment we had projected onto one another. It took time, but soon enough, laughter replaced the tension, and while Ethan's antics didn't disappear entirely, resilience threaded its way back into our family fabric. I learned that sometimes, letting go of boundaries doesn't mean accepting chaos but inviting each other to grow and learn within that chaos, and maybe, just maybe, love would find its way back to our table one meal at a time. I never thought a simple trip to the store would turn my life upside down, but here I am, staring at a deliberately cracked rearview mirror and my shaking hands as I replay that day like a broken record. It was a Thursday afternoon when I made my way to the local grocery store, the kind where you can already smell the fresh bread wafting through the air the moment you step inside. I parked my car, a rickety old hatchback that sometimes felt more like a death trap than a mode of transport, and grabbed my reusable bags, satisfied at the thought of stocking up on supplies for the week ahead. As soon as I stepped out into the sun, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, but I shrugged it off. I was just being paranoid. As I navigated through the aisles, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, I felt an odd sense of unease gathering in the pit of my stomach, like a storm gathering clouds, but the distraction of choosing ripe avocados kept me focused. Then, just as I was about to pay, the store manager, a burly man with a thick mustache, confronted me. He pointed an accusatory finger and demanded to know why I had parked in the customer parking lot despite being a non-customer. My heart sank as I stammered out an explanation, grappling for words to deny the absurd claim. The truth was, I had shopped there plenty before. I was a loyal customer even if I wore the same ratty hoodie every time. But he wasn't having it, and soon enough, a crowd gathered around us like vultures drawn to a dying animal, some taking pictures on their phones, others whispering behind their hands. I felt my face burn as outrage and embarrassment battled inside me. I tried to plead my case, but the manager's eyes were void of sympathy, and he kept saying I had stolen a space meant for paying customers, almost reveling in my unease. The chatter swirled around me, and through it all, I became acutely aware of the other customers' judgmental stares, their silent alliances forming against me. Just when I thought it couldn't get worse, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I whipped around to see a stranger who claimed to have witnessed everything. The wrinkle-faced woman looked deep into my eyes and said she had seen me walk into the store without a cart, evidence of my guilt, she implied. Before I knew it, I was in a full-blown confrontation, surrounded by angry voices as the scene devolved, and I felt trapped in a surreal nightmare where all I wanted was to grab my groceries and leave. I thought I would cry, the humiliation of it all, so I decided to cut my losses and walk away. But before I made it to the door, I heard a loud shout that made me spin. "You think this is okay? You think you can do whatever you want?" It was a younger guy, he must have been no older than 25, and he was practically shaking with rage. My instinct told me to just leave, yet I felt a compulsion to respond. "I can park anywhere that's not specifically marked," I said, my voice tinged with desperation. "I'm a customer." Somehow, the words fell flat, and within minutes, I felt like I was the villain in a crime thriller. People were snapping photos, and I couldn't help but feel like I was reshaping their perception of me into something monstrous and self-serving. Heavy with the risk of escalation, I bolted toward my car, but the crowd followed me, whispers morphing into accusations, and I could hear the word entitlement thrown around like a weapon. My shaking fingers struggled with the keys, the metal digging into my palm like the weight of the judgments surrounding me. In that moment, a primal panic kicked in, and I took off, barely managing to slam the door behind me before revving the engine. I glanced in my rearview mirror, the crowd dwindled but still, those eyes followed me as I sped away, fueled by something more than just righteous indignation. I thought about what they believed of me, a thief in plain view, a villain unseen until I was thrust into the light. I had an incessant feeling of being stalked as I drove home, every car a possible threat, every intersection a heightened crossroads of shame. By the time I reached my neighborhood, the weight of my crime settled heavily on my shoulders, pulling my spirit down. I locked the door behind me, determined never to revisit that store again, but the fallout was far from over. Over the next few days, I watched anxiously as the topic spiraled on social media. Someone had posted a video of the confrontation, painting me as a monster in need of public scorn. The comments were merciless, people calling for my head because of a miscommunication blown out of proportion. I struggled to sleep. Images of that mob haunted me as I tossed and turned, each creak of the house sending jolting terror coursing through me. I tried to remain disconnected, but it was impossible to ignore the shame, the anger, and the community I thought I belonged to suddenly turning their backs on me. I stopped going out, avoiding the grocery store like it was a plague zone, but I still heard whispers as I passed others in my neighborhood. Then came the calls. I got them all right, late at night just as I was starting to succumb to the silence of my home. They were taunting, anonymous voices echoing the very accusations that had attacked me days prior. I blocked number after number, but they kept coming, like a relentless tide, washing over me, burying me in guilt for something I had believed was just a simple parking dispute. I no longer found joy in cooking for myself or curling up with a good book. All I felt in the pit of my stomach was an ever-gnawing shame that clung to me like a shadow, relentless and suffocating. I began to question my own sanity. Had I really parked illegally? Did my neighbor slip the manager my license plate? The whispers grew louder, and they felt like the predator closing in on its prey. Then one night it all came to a head. I found myself pacing the floor, drowning out the voices in my head. I had to know the truth. The next day, I ventured out once more, heart pounding like a drum but determined to confront my fears head-on. I needed to know if it was true or just a horrible delusion created by my escalating paranoia. I parked in a remote corner of the lot, hidden behind a line of bushes, and I watched as the store, the employees, the manager, the customers, all of them went about their business, seemingly unaware of the nightmare that they had thrust upon me. It was then that I saw her, the woman from that day, her eyes scanning the parking lot, locking once again on a car that was far from mine. I noticed something was off, a slight look of satisfaction overtaking her usually neutral expression as she walked toward the store. She turned and looked right in my direction, but I was smart enough to stay hidden. In that haunting moment, I understood, this was never about a parking lot. It was about a power struggle, a humiliation that they sought to inflict on someone who didn't fit their ideal of a perfect customer. I got back into my car and drove away, heart racing, but deep down I felt empowered. I finally had clarity of a sort. Perhaps I could never return to a place I loved, but now I knew, I was never going to be their scapegoat again. In lieu of acceptance, I chose to carve out my own reality, for whatever it was worth. As for the accusations, Ida. Well, maybe parking in that lot was the least of my sins, but now I'm focusing on how to rise from the ashes of a grocery store confrontation that left me feeling more human than ever.